Welcome back, everybody. This is The Changelog. We're a member-supported blog and podcast that covers what's fresh and what's new in open source. You can check out the blog at thechangelog.com and our past shows at 5by5.tv/changelog. This show is hosted by myself, Adam Stacoviak, and also Andrew Thorp. Andrew, say hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Fabuloso. Just want to see that on air. That's so awesome. You can tune in live to the show every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time right here on 5by5. And today, we're joined by two awesome fellows. This is episode number 99.
Whoa.
And we're, 99, right?
Yeah.
And we're joined by Jeff, Lindsay, and Jonathan Rudenberg. Jeff has worked on projects like Local Tunnel, Request Bin, and Get Receive, not Get Creative, but I'm sure that's creative. Jonathan's one of the two designers behind Tent Protocol, and together they are building Flynn, which is an open-sourced platform as a service, which is powered by Docker. So if you've listened to, what was that episode number, Andrew?
I think it was 94, but 94. That's could be wrong.
Could be wrong. Don't hold us to that. But nonetheless, welcome to the show, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
That was the most dramatic, crazy intro ever on the Changelog. This is a long-winded intro. I don't like them. I'm never doing it again. So, Jeff, Jonathan, you guys have kind of teamed up on this new project. It's kind of unique the way you've done it. We, the Changelog, gave a little bit of money to it. We didn't quite give as much as some of the suggestions, but we did give a little bit. But I think it's pretty neat. So,
yeah.
We wanted to have you guys on the show talk about what an open source platform as a service means, and I guess maybe key off of some of the conversations we had around Docker too.
It might make sense if you guys just kind of wanted to give us a kind of a intro to who each of you are and your background. Then we can talk about some of the other projects you worked on and jump into Flynn.
Sure. I'll let Jeff go first.
Oh, I am sort of a rogue engineer, consultant now. I worked at Twilio for a little while, but that was sort of my only full-time job. Most of the time I'm doing open source stuff. I popularized webhooks back in the day, and I've done a startup. I've done all kinds of stuff, mostly writing lots of open source software that nobody knows about.
You're Progrium on Twitter.
Yeah.
If people don't know the name Jeff Lindsay, probably more familiar with Progrium. So on GitHub, you have a lot of open source kind of behind your name, so we'll definitely want to jump into that. But Jonathan, why don't you give us a little intro?
Yeah. So I've been a developer for a while. I started at Shopify in my professional career. Before that, I did a little bit of Rails consulting here and there, and then I kind of moved to doing this thing called Tent, which is actually a protocol, not a piece of software. There's reference software that implements it. And I'm largely interested in all things related to servers and more on the server-side stuff. So I built lots of random open source software on GitHub. A while back I did this thing called Mailman, which is a Ruby gem that essentially handles incoming email. So doing Ruby and Go lately.
Oh, you wrote that?
Yeah.
Nice.
Why don't you give us a little bit of an intro to Tent? I think this is neat. Not something we talk about a lot on the show, protocols and things like that, but why don't you kind of give us an intro to what Tent is and where it came from?
Sure. So Tent is a protocol for personal data storage and decentralized communication. So it presents just as a JSON protocol on top of HTTP, just kind of using RESTful verbs, etc. And essentially what you do is you pass around posts. So you have a server that represents you as a user, and then you have applications that talk to that server, similar to how you'd authenticate an app with Twitter. You just use OAuth. And then your applications can create these JSON posts on the server, and your server sends those posts to other people's servers, or perhaps they're private and it just stores them on the server. And then you can create anything with Tent from Twitter to Facebook. You could even do Dropbox because you can store binary attachments along with the posts. So it's essentially just evented data in a server, very simple, RESTful access to it. And it ends up being really flexible. We created it as a sort of alternative to all of the centralized platforms that exist these days. Think Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc.
Is it Have you seen any, big projects kind of adopt this protocol?
So it's still very new. We're coming up on version 0.3 of the protocol, and we haven't been really doing an adoption push yet because we're still like developing the protocol and sorting out what should be in the 1.0. So we have like a microblogging app that we host, and we do like tent hosting. I've kind of started a startup on the side, myself and a few others who work on the protocol, and so we're doing that as tent hosting, and then and others have built some like mobile apps and desktop apps that mostly just do microblogging at this point, but there's cool new stuff coming.
What goes into like I don't know, when you're, if you're working on a piece of software and you sit down and you think you have feature requests or features and bugs and, different pieces that you have to plan out and build, what goes into like a planning session when creating a protocol?
It's a lot of like brainstorming on a whiteboard, essentially, just kind of like talking through use cases and sorting out. We've been trying to do like use case driven development where we don't actually add a feature to the protocol unless we actually have an application that either like has a need for it, or we are like about to make an application that needs it, because otherwise you end up with like weird things that you think you're going to need but that you don't actually need. And so it requires a lot more thought than your typical software project, because you can like slash out features really easily, but with a protocol it's really hard to take features out. 0.3 was actually a completely breaking release. We were changing just about everything about the protocol from what we learned with the past, 8 months or so of the protocol being in kind of production with a bunch of nodes on the network kind of talking to each other.
The thing that I liked about the project when I first heard about it was how kind of it took the evented web ideas and like webhooks as like a core concept in it. Because other than things like PubSub, Hubbub, I hadn't really seen those kinds of HTTP callbacks used in more of a standard.
Yeah, it's entirely push driven. So when you create a post, like for instance, like a status post, which is our equivalent to like a Twitter post, your server will then push that post out via webhooks to all of your subscribers that are permitted to see the post. So it's kind of like near real time. You wouldn't want to do IM over it necessarily, but within a few seconds, all of your followers have gotten the posts.
Yeah, so it's interesting, kind of, you can see, where you two kind of got together, and you both have as you said, Jeff, you both have a kind of a passion for like the evented web. So you wrote I don't know what the best way to put it is, but you basically, popularized the webhook pattern, and it's been kind of adopted by Google, GitHub, like everybody. What kind of sparked you to create that? When did you write about that, and where did that come from?
I was doing a startup at the time called DevJavu, and it was basically a hosted track and SVN, but as a product. So it wasn't like, here's some free hosting, or here's like shared hosting with like track and SVN tacked on. It was like as a product. And during that time, I was trying to figure out how to expose SVN hooks via HTTP, and it just made sense to do hooks as HTTP, and you put in a URL, and then when the hook triggers, it would call that URL. And then just all of a sudden, I realized, wow, I guess there was one reference before that was kind of popular, which was the PayPal IPN. So that was the real only good example I had to go from, because nobody else was really doing it. And I was like, well, you can do all kinds of stuff with this. You can do, all kinds of real time. It wasn't just that you get real time and that you get push. It was that any web developer can handle it. Like if you can write a PHP script, you could handle a webhook. And so I started kind of raving about it to everybody, and nobody really got it, and I just kept doing it, and eventually people started getting it and started using them and saying, oh, this is actually really cool. And then I made a bunch of adapters. I made one of the first things that I wrote was called Mailhooks, or mailhook.org. I think it's still online, but it doesn't work. But the idea was, again, kind of like Mailman, it would do HTTP, SMTP to HTTP. So incoming, you'd go to the site, get an email address, associate with a URL, and then when email comes in, it would do all the parsing for you and post it to your URL like it was a form post, which makes handling incoming email super trivial, no matter what language you're using. You just have to be a web developer and know how to handle a post.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the modern software development world without webhooks. When I mean, all of the services that your typical developer uses are all integrated through these webhooks, and I mean it's pretty cool that you kind of pioneered that road, and you can kind of see then is that the idea of that intent, is that how you two kind of got together and started talking about Flynn, or did you guys meet each other some other way?
We met through a mutual friend who's actually one of the co-designers of the Tent protocol, and we share a lot of similar interests. We've been talking about PaaS stuff for, I don't know, quite a while now. Kind of like we want to do something that looks like Flynn, and just recently we decided to actually go in and do it.
Yeah, Daniel, and I think I met him either at a Super Epi Dev House. I think it was a Dev House event, which don't really happen anymore, but used to be big back in the day.
Yeah. So, Jeff, real quick, we don't have a ton of time to talk about each individual project, and then also talk about Flynn, but why don't you give us a little kind of, I don't know, maybe an intro and just a little bit about a few of these projects, Local Tunnel being the first.
So a lot of my work revolves around making developer tools, which is an interesting kind of place to be in, especially when you kind of have this sort of desire to create consumer-like products, and where you consider ease of use and simplicity and all this stuff, and most developers just want to solve a problem. Because when I came out with Local Tunnel, there was really nothing like it. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff, but the idea was, well, I do this a lot using SSH tunnels. Wouldn't it be great if I could just say Local Tunnel 8000 and expose that port to the internet? I did a bunch of prototypes and finally got a version that worked. And it just kind of slowly started taking off, and now there's all people building businesses around similar ideas and stuff like that. But it was just about taking that. A lot of what I do is about usually making a more complicated thing simpler and more accessible to people. It's kind of seems to be like a common pattern. Like Docker, I was involved in Docker for a little bit in the really early, before it was open source, and in a way, it's sort of about making containers more accessible and more useful to people.
Yeah, one of our coworkers actually at Adam and mine day job at Pure Charity is working on something similar to Local Tunnel called Portly, and it's same idea, being able to publish your local, what you're working on locally. So to me, the big probably thing that sticks out about Local Tunnel, and one of the reasons why I never actually covered it on the changelog, we talked about, we went back and forth a lot, is from version 1 to version 2, you went from Ruby to Python.
Yeah.
Would you actually explain?
Well,
Sorry?
Yeah, the server was always in Python. The server was written in, it's sort of bootstrapped off of SSHD and then had a twisted kind of server-side component. But the client was Ruby. But the client was really just like an SSH client. Like all it did was wrap an SSH library. I'm not too much of a. I really like building tools that are kind of community agnostic. So a lot. HTTP is something that every community knows how to work with, and so it was kind of a weird thing to have like the client in Ruby and the server in Python. To me, it didn't matter, but now I've kind of seen that it makes a big difference. When you start a project, what language you use and what effect that has on what kind of responses it gets and what kind of people are willing to contribute to it. So I started version 2 that was written entirely in Python just because I sort of use Python more, and I had to write more code because I didn't want to depend on SSHD anymore, because it was kind of this big complicated black box and people would create tunnels and sometimes the SSHD processes would hang and I have no idea what's going on. So I wanted to create a simple protocol, and so running more code, I wrote it in Python. And that's kind of been in this weird kind of active development stage for a while. And a couple of people are running it. It's not actually running right now, but a couple of people run their own instances, like RunScope. They actually recently took one of my projects, RequestBin, and are sort of taking it to the next level while keeping it open source. So I'm glad it has like a new home. But what's happened actually is a friend of mine has written. I eventually wanted to rewrite Local Tunnel in Go. So I told a friend of mine that I wanted to do that, and so he went off and kind of wrote a Go version of it while we were both working at Twilio. And he kept hacking on it, and eventually he released it as ngrok. And so it's basically the exact same kind of architecture and model as the new Local Tunnel, except it's actually a lot better. So very recently, we actually, when people complain about like Local Tunnel's not running or it's not working for me, I say, well, go check out ngrok, because it's what Local Tunnel should be. And we actually just recently have decided we're actually creating, like there's actually a V3 branch in Local Tunnel now that is basically just going to be ngrok. We are more or less merging projects.
Gotcha.
So then now it'll be written in Go.
So you're a language, you're a dynamic language adapter.
Yeah, I mean, I usually stick with one thing, but I'm pretty flexible.
Gotcha. You talked about RequestBin a little bit. That's another project you worked on. What is RequestBin?
So, thinking about webhooks and this ideal of like the evented web led to a lot of stuff like Local Tunnel, because that was the idea is if I write a webhook script, it has to be accessible on the internet. So if I want to develop it locally, I need to expose it to the internet. So that led to Local Tunnel. Another thing is if I use a site that has, takes URLs for webhook requests, I want to, it's actually pretty easy to, they don't really need to document their payload if I can just see some examples. So the idea was if I create a site where I can just get a URL to use, and give them that URL and they post to it, and then I can go to a similar URL to see what they posted in sort of a nicely formatted way, that would become a very useful debugging tool for webhooks. It turned out to be a more generally useful tool, just like Local Tunnel, to just inspect HTTP requests. Like if you want to try a client and see what kind of headers it sends by default, you can just point it to a request bin. And I think there's been some similar clones of that too. But I'm excited about what RunScope's going to do with it because they've given it a new design and all this great stuff. So
yeah, it's cool. So it seems like you kind of you may have alluded to this a little bit before, but it seems like you kind of write the first version of software and then someone else takes it and runs with it as their full-time thing when you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I mean you kind of have to. It's even worse though with services because when you're writing open source software like a library or an application, you can kind of write it and get it to maybe a stable point, and maybe you've developed a community and you can kind of, let somebody else become a maintainer and move on. But when you run something as a service, like a free Local Tunnel server or RequestBin or these things, it starts to get very difficult because somebody has to run operations on it and pay for it. And actually, this is actually the very start of the kernel of the idea for how I sort of started thinking about what Flynn is, finally, was back in 2008 when I was thinking about webhooks and building these kind of lightweight adapter services like mail hooks, and I made a bunch of other ones. One called ClickHooks where, and I think this still works because it's running on App Engine, clickhooks.org. It's like a URL shortener where you put in a URL to redirect to, and then you get another URL. But when you click that URL, it also triggers a webhook. So for a while I was using that I wrapped my subscribe to my blog link in that and then had it post to a service that I previously used to run called Notify.io that would give me a growl notification when anybody clicked that link. So the idea though was I want to run a lot of these services, but unlike a regular open source project, I can't just like hand it off. Like there's money involved and all this stuff. And so the idea was things like App Engine just blew me away because I was like, okay, it's a lot easier. Operations is now a lot simpler. The cost model is a lot simpler, and more efficient, effective, cost effective. And so I was in love with App Engine. And then I was in love with Heroku. And so that led to this love of platform services. And then when I was at Twilio, we kind of realized the thing was I was always butting heads against like what they would let you do. For example, I say Heroku would be 10 times more useful if they just didn't have their HTTP router, because then you could run anything. You could run mail servers, you could do all kinds of stuff, because it's a very general platform at its core. And so that's a lot of these ideas. And actually, I was hired by some friends at NASA when they were working on what became OpenStack to basically build. The original vision for OpenStack was actually not just like an EC2 clone and an S3 clone, these things. It would actually have a platform as a service layer. But it turned out that it was really difficult to do that first lower level layer. And so I never actually got to building it, but I spent a lot of time thinking about it while I was there. So I've just been thinking about this platform stuff for years, for a lot of different reasons. And so, when I got to the end of my time at Twilio, I kind of had some good ideas. Like I had basically sketched out the idea of Docker, and I just happened to run into Solomon. He's like, "Oh, we're doing the same." So we collaborated on that, and that was just like a means to building something like Flynn.
Yeah, Flynn is a pretty neat thing. I mean, coming from the love of Heroku and obviously App Engine and that, I mean, getting that experience with a platform. And then I guess just serendipitously being involved with Solomon and the early days of Docker. When did Flynn come around then, I guess? When did you guys actually start collaborating on it and thinking things through and starting to I guess, even flesh out the idea of raising money to make this, kind of community supported but still open source?
So we started talking about it, I guess, last year sometime, but it was like, this is something we need to do soon. We didn't really have time to do it at the time. And just recently, I was talking to my former employer, Shopify, and I was like, hey, I really want to do this thing. Do you want to sponsor it? And Toby, CEO of Shopify, was actually, yeah, totally. We'd love to sponsor it. And then we were talking about it more, and we thought that there might be some other companies that would be interested in sponsoring it. We didn't think there'd be that many that would just up and give us cash right out without knowing us. But we put up a site with the Stripe button, and it turned out to get way, way more money than we were expecting without doing much sales, I guess.
Yeah, I know right now you're sitting at 108% funded, so that's $80,713 of the $75,000 you guys intended to raise. What was the impetus around determining how much money to raise?
It's kind of a lowball estimate of what it would cost for us to spend 6 months building Flynn, myself mostly full-time, and Jeff close-ish to full-time. Yeah, part-time.
So you mentioned Shopify. You got quite a few other, and we can name them all if you want to, but just some logos that look nice that stand out to me, like Lab Division, Nebula, Local Web. Are these friends of yours, or they just kind of come out of the woodwork and like, hey, yeah, we'll support Flynn?
A few are friends. Most of them just found it through the Hacker News article and Twitter, and just out of the blue decided to support Flynn, I guess, after reading the docs and, shooting a few emails, talking in IRC, etc.
Yeah. One of the things we talk about on the show a lot is sustainability. So I noticed that you kind of have, $75,000 was the goal, and the when will it be ready frequently asked question kind of says it's like 6 months. So after 6 months, in terms of, funding or next steps, what's the kind of like the goal for Flynn at that point?
So in 6 months, we hope to have something that's runnable as an internal service at companies for perhaps running their internal services. Most of the companies I've interacted with of any size have a bunch of tiny little internal apps, from things like dashboards to employee directories and the whole gamut of other stuff. So it should be able to run those types of services, basically like your Heroku 12-factor apps. And then after that, well, it's just one step at a time.
Do you foresee yourself working on this full time, or would you go to another project type of a thing?
So my time is split between this and Tent, and that's all I've been working on and will be working on for the foreseeable future.
Gotcha. It's cool. The second frequently asked question is it open source? And your answer is 100%. It's really cool to see how passionate you are to ensure that this is going to be and remain open source. What's the driving reason for that for you?
The thing is that from what I've seen, there's a lot of companies that either need this or are building a version of this right now. And for it not to be open source, for it just to be like one company's internal tool really sucks for the rest of us, because then we have to build it. So I think that if a few people step up to build something that everyone needs, then that just saves everyone a lot of time.
You mentioned that you guys, I guess, had early relationships with Solomon and Docker, and since we're talking about FAQs, it says, how is it related to Docker? And you say that you've been working with the .cloud team on Docker since before its public launch to make sure it was suitable for this project. So it sounds like, maybe early days of Docker, you knew about Flynn.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was, and Docker has become so much more than I could have ever hoped, and it's really part of Solomon's vision, and it just so happens that our visions align so much for that tool. But really what I wanted when I was at Twilio, and I was trying to think, so my second year at Twilio became focused on what we call the platform team, which we wanted our ideal product of that team to basically be an internal platform that the rest of the developers could use to build all these services. Twilio is actually a very highly service-oriented architecture with 200 different types of services. So trying to make that experience for developers and operations both consistent and an enjoyable experience. We wanted something like Heroku. We couldn't use Heroku because we're doing more than HTTP, and we want to have control over how the scheduler works because of various whatever our SLA policies are and stuff like that. So it really became clear we needed to build our own. And since then, I've heard lots of companies, like Jonathan was saying, that want to do the same thing. And so at the end of my time there, I was like, well, the first component is probably like a dyno manager, like something the equivalent of the Heroku dyno, which is more or less a high-level container mostly made for services. But really, once you have that primitive, you can do a lot of different stuff with it. And so I kind of sketched that out with the idea that it is part of this bigger puzzle of this platform. Really a framework, or I really like building tools that are sort of really kind of independently useful components, sort of that Unix philosophy of doing one thing that works well, that does one thing well and works with other components. And so that was kind of a differentiating concept that we had going into Flynn, is making a system that is components but isn't just a monolithic set of components, but is actually basically a set of independently useful components. So for example, if we get receive, which is sort of an early version of the type of thing that we would have for like a Git front end for Flynn, that's independently useful because you can use it to wrap any other kind of Git based workflow type of thing. You can push a repository to it and it'll run a shell script. And so you can use that to do all kinds of, you can use it to put Git in front of App Engine and be able to deploy to App Engine via Git. So Docker was one of these many components. It was just one of the most important ones. And so I did go into working with Solomon to make sure that it met these requirements. And I continue to push still to make sure that Docker meets the requirements for these sort of things for a system like Flynn. And I hope that can be replicated for all the components, so we can find if we're building it for Flynn, we can get somebody else to use the component for something completely different to ensure that it is, general enough and simple enough, but simple enough to satisfy both uses.
So let's kind of fill in the blanks real quick. Why don't you give us like the pitch for Flynn, the what Flynn is in a sentence for somebody that's never heard of it.
Jonathan?
Sure. So Flynn is a set of building blocks that, when put together in their default configuration, presents a lot like Heroku. So you're just doing like Git pushing apps, and then a build pack deploys it. But at a lower level, it's managing just containers with Unix services in them across a cluster, and then each of the building blocks that are used to build Flynn can be replaced or reused. So it's a modular system. It's extensible. And it doesn't require you to use it in its default configuration.
So Flynn out of the box, you could think of like a Flynn distribution is all these components made together, made to come out of the box, work like your own private Heroku. But for example, like I said, Heroku, you get an HTTP router, and maybe that HTTP router supports things like WebSockets, or maybe it doesn't. Ours will, but you might want to remove the router completely because you're going to be doing other stuff, or you might want to replace the router with your own router. And so we really want to make sure that this is very, again, that component philosophy is you can recombine these things or replace things. And a lot of these components are running in sort of a core Flynn, lower level platform. And so a lot of these components run in Flynn itself. And so you can replace them and deploy them in the same way you would your apps that you run on it.
Gotcha. Do you have like a high level, from 20,000 feet, like where do you make the separation of the modules and like your default set, like you said, the router is interchangeable. You can put a different router in there, or you can take it out or whatever. Do you kind of have the plan for like what pieces are interchangeable and where you make that distinction at?
We have sort of this high level architecture of the problems that we need to solve, things like the router, the scheduler, and the Git front end and the management API and all these things. But when you get into actually solving those problems, you end up realizing, oh well, this can be solved with a simpler component or a set of these components. And so really, as you go into those problems, try and break them down into smaller, simpler components and problems that you're trying to solve. And so it's kind of a iterative discovery process. And so there's both high level and low level kind of concepts of how this breaks down into components.
I mentioned early in the show that we supported Flynn, and we kind of immediately blogged about it and featured it on the changelog. And one of the followers of the changelog, Mark Jellin, who is also a platform as a service advocate, kind of tweeted back to us and said that, I guess just the way we worded our tweet, like support Flynn to help make PaaS open source. And he replied, there are at least 2 perfectly good open source platform as a service projects. Why do you act as there's none? And then also on your FAQs, there's a mention of Cloud Foundry, OpenShift, and a couple others that are mentioned. And can you just kind of contrast what the differences are, I guess, between what Flynn aims to do and what others have tried to do or are doing?
So from the beginning, like for example, App Engine, it came out and it was super useful, but it's very constrained to sort of this paradigm of web apps. And Heroku and .cloud actually, because they kind of in parallel sort of follow the same development path in a lot of ways, generalize that. So it's really about just running a Unix process as a service. But they're still based on deploying web apps and all their conventions and, the HTTP router and all this. And even though they've made progress, App Engine is still, very much focused on web apps, and they've kind of hacked a bunch of extra features to make it a little bit more, but it's still like the way it was designed originally is still focused on web apps. And I think a lot of the open source projects that are trying to solve this platform service problem are sort of similar. They're still geared a little bit too much towards web applications to be useful for me. Another one, because I've done Cloud Foundry consulting, and there's just they I don't want to speak for all of them, but many of them are they try and break them down into components, but they're still this sort of monolithic beast. It's very complicated, and each of the components isn't very well documented, and it becomes very difficult to deploy the thing. And so that kind of user experience is something that we want to try and make much better. So the out-of-the-box experience is much better, but you still have that hackability. You can drill down and actually pretty easily kind of see how everything works together and start hacking it and taking it apart and doing whatever you want with it. And so to me, actually, it's not so much about building a platform service. It's about building tools for building your own platform or your own really it's a toolkit for building distributed systems.
Yeah, it sounds like the keywords that you're saying is like a set of like and you, just to use your words in your FAQ best, you say a set of modular components. It seems like you're really, like you'd mentioned, you're more focused on the individualized components and how that makes up what actually is a platform as a service, much like Heroku, without the, some of the pieces that have kind of upset you or didn't kind of put some blockers in front of you with using Heroku like you wanted to before.
Yeah, so it's really taking a lot of the technology that was developed in building platform services and making them more accessible, but then, decoupling them so that you can use them for different things. Like container technology was really, I think, developed by platform services, companies like Heroku and .cloud. But it turns out when you break that out into a component like Docker, it's immediately useful for all kinds of other stuff that has nothing to do with running a platform service. And so there's all this great stuff in there that's useful for building your systems that we want people to kind of, take advantage of.
So right now, just the spec is on GitHub, and I know you're past the 100% mark in terms of meeting your minimum funding goal, but we talked earlier too about 6 months, a certain time frame and whatnot. But when should the community begin to see a repo pop up and commits happen, and I guess start seeing progress towards what Flynn's going to be?
Within the next few weeks, for sure. We're currently just kind of talking through some like high-level stuff, just getting our bearings, and then we're going to start diving into components really soon.
Talking about the Flynn spec, is that written in sand or written in stone?
Sand. That's actually just like a bunch of bullet points we put together, like even before we put the Flynn.io site together. It's pretty old at this point.
So when people kind of started to support this project financially, what do you think it was? Well, first of all, we've talked about, like we said, sustainability, and we've had people talk about different, funding models or revenue models for open source projects, whether it's we've talked about, we had GitHub on the show at one point, or we've had, people like Sidekick, like Mike Perrin with Sidekick, where he releases it open source, but then builds some, professional features on top of it and charges for like a monthly rate. What did drive you to kind of go with the pay ahead, almost the Kickstarter-esque without the minimum goal model for Flynn?
So funding open source is a really hard problem. Most projects are small, and some ask for donations, but most don't see more than $20, maybe a year or something. So we looked to the Kickstarter model. There's been a few open source projects that were funded quite successfully, and we decided that there are actually companies that were interested in funding rather than individuals. We've had lots of individuals sponsor Flynn, but the vast majority of the money came from corporate sponsorships, companies that want to use Flynn. So that's what we targeted essentially.
Yeah, I think the lowest tier was actually $1,500. So it's very clearly targeted towards companies wanting to sponsor, and that sort of makes sure that we're solving a problem for business. So all our sponsors are sort of going to be able to participate in conversations about. And I've actually been going out to a lot of companies and just talking to them in person to learn about their requirements and stuff like that. So we can kind of continue to refine the design of this thing and make sure that we're building something that's simple but is able to satisfy all these requirements.
So since we're, I guess, on the subject of sustaining, I guess, in some capacity, you've got the funding you guys requested. I guess what's the plan in the future for, I guess, sustaining this past this point? Like, is it go back to these original sponsored companies or back to the community and say, I guess, what's the plan to, I guess, sustain?
So we could raise more sponsorship. We actually have talked to a lot of companies, much more in depth about the technology than some of the people that have sponsored so far, that are very willing to sponsor and we're about to, but we were sort of like, well, we reached our goal. We'll come back to you later. But they were very willing to, let us know. They're just very excited about the project and the approach and all this stuff to be able to help us out, because they're seeing all of these problems. And I'm super surprised just how many companies internally are sort of realizing that what they want is sort of an internal platform service. And again, that's sort of one of the things that differentiates us is a lot of these open source platform services, PaaS's, are made to be run as a PaaS, service. Not, they've got billing and quotas and, all this stuff kind of built in so that it's made for someone to kind of deploy and resell or something like that. And we expect that at some point people might add that to Flynn, but really we want to, a lot of internal use cases don't need any of that. So we're just kind of avoiding all of that for Flynn. And so it's kind of a different use case.
Yeah, our target customers are the operations teams at the medium to small size startups that are kind of struggling with the amount of work that it takes to deploy each new application. So it's almost like the project has a different customer than the existing projects in the same space.
Right. Look, can you pause there for a second? Because there's one quote, I guess, another praise for Flynn that I think needs a mention, and I guess it kind of maybe expands a little bit more on this, which is from Tobias at Shopify. He said, "The future of operations is to function like a product team that services the developers of the company as a client." So when you kind of flip that on its head, it's like, you're targeting towards, I guess, the Shopifys and people like that are wanting to support you guys, but it's in an effort to help their development teams and their operations teams better interface between DevOps and developers.
Yeah, I think, and at Twilio, that was the idea, was we wanted the platform team to basically build a self-serve platform in much the same way that so many startups use EC2, where you just have this great, layer of abstraction, and they take care of, like, people kind of, are arguing about the value of the cloud and stuff like that. But the stuff that they do and abstract away for you is incredibly amazing. And so the thing is, though, is that there's no kind of layer of abstraction between EC2 and a Heroku. And so we kind of want to open up that spectrum of abstractions and capabilities for operators, and to the benefit of both operators and developers, because Heroku is a great developer experience, right?
So kind of talking about Heroku, you have another project called Docu that you worked on.
Doku, yeah.
Or Doku. I want to say Docu because of Docker, but yeah, it's KK. So I noticed, I think Flynn kind of came about, what'd you say, like a month ago maybe? Is that right?
Yeah.
And then the initial commit on Doku was 2 months ago. So what was was Flynn already in mind when Doku was started, or, kind of how does that relationship work out?
Well, like I said, I've been thinking about this for a ridiculously long time, and since even before Docker existed. And I actually gave a talk with Solomon at, I think, GlueCon, and I wanted to give an example of how you could use Docker to build a platform service. And by then, Docker had been developed enough that it did actually do most of the work to actually make a pretty simple kind of Heroku-like service. So in 6 hours, I spent like the day before the talk actually building the first version of Doku. And the idea was that it was super simple, right? Because Docker does most of the heavy lifting, and trying to just do the simplest thing possible that works, with the constraint that it's, it only works on a single host. It's not a distributed system. But it turns out that actually is pretty useful. A lot of people want like their own little mini Heroku. And so Doku started, I released Doku a little while after that, because I had added virtual hosts, because that makes it a little bit more closer to like Heroku, where you have a subdomain for your app. And I just started working on that on the side for fun, and it got a lot of attention. And that sort of was happening separately / in parallel to talking with these guys about working on Flynn. And so a lot of the same philosophies, and actually a lot of the components that we would be using for Flynn will be pulled into Doku. And Doku kind of gives us an idea of some of the components that we need for Flynn. For example, Doku uses get receive to handle pushing via Git. And so we know that get receive is not ideal for building a distributed, scalable system, but it solves the problem well in Doku for a single host. However, if we take that same component and re-implement it in Go, and make it a little bit more general and fitting for a distributed environment, it's more or less the same component but works for Flynn, and then we can run it on a single host and it works for Doku. So Doku for me is going to continue to be a single host, more or less like a single host distribution of Flynn. And so for me, it's kind of a prototyping ground for ideas for Flynn. But yeah, it's kind of different goals, single host.
Gotcha. So this is going to be kind of, I don't know, maybe like supercharged version of Doku or the Doku plus.
Yeah, actually, on the README for Doku, I sort of, when I was explaining what it's not, it's not multi-host, it's, not made for a multi-tenancy sort of thing. It's I said maybe those are features for Super Doku, and then it just so happened that Flynn is more or less what Super Doku would have been. There's actually some other great projects built around Docker, and it's on Hacker News today. Somebody told me Dias, which I actually saw quite a bit before because they're sort of in the Docker community. They're released, and so they're another platform service built on Docker, and already we're sharing components. Like I wrote for BuildStat for Doku, and we'll use it for Flynn, is this piece called BuildStep, which is maybe more accurately something like Heroku Stack, because it's basically a builder and runner for Heroku build packs in Docker. And so they're using that for their platform service, and I'm using it for Doku, and we'll be using it for Flynn.
Can I ask maybe not so much I guess, I'm not really sure how this question will be sounded, I guess, but you say things like in the areas of, I guess for Doku, ideas for improvements where you say Heroku-ish commands. I mean, I know Heroku is a for-profit company and they're doing some awesome stuff in open source too, but does any of this cross lines? Does anybody call you and be like, hey, stop doing what you're doing, we don't really want to support that because maybe Heroku wants to protect their market share?
Well, I've been friends with a lot of the Heroku engineers for a while, and I use them. So, I'm sort of a power user, so I go to their offices fairly frequently when I do stuff like I made a web service that you actually put on App Engine that lets you register new Heroku accounts, because I was working on a project that needed to let you create like infinite number of apps, so I needed to be able to create a bunch of user accounts, and I do stuff like that. Or one time I made a script that uses Heroku's ability to run arbitrary commands with their run command, and use that to deploy something to itself, so it could kind of self-deploy. I'm doing just all these weird things with Heroku, and so very often they'll kind of like pull me in and want to talk about it or see what's going on. I've actually been, a lot of the times there will be like product development discussions like, you're trying to do this, so, how does this sound, and we actually have these kind of useful conversations. But I've heard, though, that some people in Heroku, who's pretty big, are sort of like, are very kind of curious about some of the stuff that I'm doing, but the majority of them actually don't know. So,
I think it's possible potentially. I know this is just being hypothetical, of course, but maybe that Heroku will be like, oh man, I love what you guys are doing with Flynn. We'll acquire you. And I know you're not really a company yet, but like,
thing
bring
to
you under their
remember
curtain and support it.
Is that Flynn is targeted to run internally. So Heroku is kind of this service that you pay for and runs on EC2 and you have no control over. Whereas we're targeting Flynn at companies that need to run something internally for whatever reason. There's a variety of reasons, from security and control to, just like latency reasons. Heroku's not in a data center that they want to be in, et cetera. So we're making Flynn for essentially the people that don't use Heroku or can't use Heroku for whatever reason. They're adjacent. They're not in direct competition, I don't think.
It's actually the same story as OpenStack, because OpenStack came from NASA, and it basically our group of people, like a ragtag team, we're trying to like make NASA cool again. We're doing all these kind of neat web apps for missions to have more participatory kind of citizen science sides to them, and we kept thinking, well, we want more people to do this in NASA, so it'd be great if we had a platform for them to do this, or even just use existing stuff like App Engine. The problem is it's government stuff, and the government requires you to use your own. They have to use their own hardware, and so that basically forced us, if we wanted to do this cool stuff, into building more or less our own EC2, and that's sort of where Nova came from in OpenStack.
I guess it's no different than saying GitHub Enterprise versus GitHub. GitHub is not gonna. They're not competing. They're different markets. I get it now.
Yeah. So when the Flynn.io launched, it said that the minimal viable product will be ready in 2 to 3 months. I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but when can we expect an MVP for Flynn?
This fall.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then, so once that comes out, are you going to give a lot of time for feedback, or is you just plowing right through towards the production version?
No, we definitely love feedback, and we get a lot of feedback already, just kind of architecturally in the approach from the various companies that we talk to and are sponsoring. But we definitely have kind of a set and actually kind of more philosophy behind a lot of this. And so we're trying to, in the process of documenting sort of our the philosophies on the decisions that we make, about all this kind of componentized philosophy, and as well as a set of sort of like technical guidelines that we're going by. And once we publish those, then hopefully it'll make suggestions and stuff like that a lot more productive, because we can easily say, well, we can't do that because we've decided philosophically that that's not for us. Now the cool thing is that if people don't like the main Flynn distribution, how we're organizing things, hopefully that a lot of the components can be used for them to sort of remix it into something that is more what they need.
Gotcha. I think it's like interesting, almost funny, that just the spec, which is like this one little README, you said just bullet points, has like 520 stars and 9 forks.
Yeah.
I mean, like, do you get, I don't know, I don't see any, but do you get like, do people take this and say, here's a, I see this as one of the general features, but you should change it to that, or why are they forking this?
There's people who have opened issues. I haven't seen any pull requests yet. That would be entertaining.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. Well, it's definitely a product that we will be keeping our eyes on, because this is something that, we talk about a lot, that we have like, well, for instance, we have preprocessors, we have SAS, right, which like boils down to, a cool way to do CSS, or a powerful way to do CSS. And at some point you think, the levels of abstraction will seem to stop. But I don't know, Flynn it gives you another use case of a higher level abstraction to, one step further than Docker. And I think that maybe this is where it stops at, but it's an exciting, interesting product that we will be watching for sure.
Me too.
Hey, well, hopefully you're watching it. So if you're new to the changelog, then we just want to let you know that we ask these 3 questions, and seeing as we have 2 guys on the show with us this time, we'll give a little extra time. But we ask 3 questions every week to our guests, and so we'll go ahead. The first question, and I'll ask you, Jeff, is for a call to arms for Flynn, as obviously right now Flynn is not in, it's not on GitHub, so it's not necessarily something that the community can actually contribute code to. But what would you like to see people or your sponsors or anybody kind of do Flynn related right now?
Well, so there is Doku, which is sort of in a sense, kind of it's a very different project, but there's still a lot of the same philosophy behind it. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, definitely check out Doku and play with it. And definitely, I think preparing people, because everybody should be able to take advantage of this Flynn, and so it'd be great to have more people involved and contributing. And so one of our sort of technical guidelines is most of our components are written in Go for various reasons that we'll document. So, and Docker itself is written in Go. And so if you need an excuse to learn Go, and you want to participate in this grand vision of Flynn, definitely take advantage of it and start playing with Go. And some of the components that we already have out there are open source, and you can start playing with them and learning Go. But Go is really awesome, so maybe that can be my call to arms.
Yeah, talking about Go, we're actually going to have Andrew from Google on next week to talk about Go, so it should be a pretty fun show. What about you, Jonathan?
I'd say pretty much the same as Jeff for Flynn. Also, Tent, if you take a look at the protocol docs and find it interesting, always love to see new applications being built, and we're always around in IRC to answer questions, etc. So have a look at Tent and start thinking about what you can build when your communications platform is decentralized instead of centralized.
And you have a nice platform like Flynn to build those on.
Yeah. Kind of a new question that we've been asking, and I'll ask you first, Jonathan. If you weren't doing this, now this is pretty new, so this might be meaningless to you, but what would you be doing if you weren't doing what you're doing right now?
If I wasn't doing open source, I would probably be a film editor. I actually went to school for a few years for filmmaking and TV broadcasting, that kind of thing, so I like that stuff too.
Gotcha. What about you, Progrium?
I struggle with this idea that I have too many interests. One of them is film, so I'd love to start doing film, but I sort of prioritize based on how well it fits into my lifestyle. So outside of programming stuff, I do a lot of music stuff, and I'm trying to make more time producing music. I actually do metal and hard rock and stuff like that, and but otherwise, I'm really into indie games. But I can't do indie games right now because it's just more programming. And so I don't want to spend my time not programming.
Gotcha. Yeah, one of our friends of the show that we have on the show a lot, Kenneth Wrights, he is also into music. It seems like that's a kind of a popular trend right now, is for developers who kind of do some release on the side with music, which is kind of a neat little thing that's going on.
Yeah, I told Kenneth we should start a band.
That's awesome. I want to give you a chance to kind of give us a shout out to someone personal or somebody that you look up to. So we call it the programming hero on the changelog. So who is your programming hero, Jeff?
I have a ton, but if I were to pick one to give a shout out to right now, it'd probably be Brett Victor. So I met him recently, and he's given a lot of amazing talks and is doing a lot of really amazing work. And he definitely falls into the realm of the type of person that inspires me. So shout out to Brett Victor.
Gotcha. And what about you, Jonathan?
I have to pick one. Shout out to Rob Pike, co-creator of the Go programming language, and he made UTF-8, which is also a really nifty encoding thing that everyone uses. I'm a huge fan of his no-nonsense design aesthetic for the software that he makes, and his one-liners on mailing lists are hilarious.
Yeah, that's a good choice. Funny story, Go is really, 20 years old, because he wrote a language called Newsqueak that is basically Go with kind of a more Fortran-looking syntax. You can look up a Google Tech Talk on him talking about concurrency. It's actually... He shows Newsqueak, and pretty much everything in it is the exact same thing in Go.
Yeah, he's been contributing to the community for quite some time. I think he was one of the designers behind Limbo. That's right, too.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Cool guy.
Yeah, it's kind of a huge throwback to our early days, but Rob Pike was on the show on episode number 2, so we...
Whoa. Oh, yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. That was the super early days, I guess. Not really early days of Go, because you just mentioned what you mentioned, so not really early, but it was around the same time of the release of Go as it is now.
Yeah, he's a good example of a programmer that works with sort of great sort of philosophy behind his work.
Yeah. Well, cool. Yeah, I know we can certainly go on for quite a while talking about this. A lot of fun conversations and topics we can certainly dive deep into, but we do have to wrap. We try to keep this show to around an hour, so sometimes we go over, sometimes we're a little under, but either way. I do want to mention 2 things before we do go. So we're just launching an every Thursday newsletter from the changelog, so if you want to sign up, you can go to thechangelog.com/newsletter. Every Thursday in your inbox, you'll get the latest from the changelog. We're also ramping up our contributors as well, so expect more on the blog. We do have our t-shirt in, so you can hack and style with your very own changelog t-shirt. You can go to thechangelog.com/store as well. So if you don't have that t-shirt, you are wrong. But Jeff, Jonathan, thank you so much for the awesome work you're doing in open source and taking the time to come talk about it on this show today. Let's say goodbye.
Thank you.
It's great being here.
See y'all later.
See ya.